It's July 21st, 2016. I'm John Moran. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself and also tell us where we are, what we're sitting on?
Okay. My name is Earl Morrogh. Today we're sitting in a cove on Lake Talquin in northwest Florida. Lake Talquin's approximately 7 miles south of the town of Quincy. The lake is a man-made lake that was formed and dammed in 1945 as a WPA project. It's a very popular fishing lake. People from all over the northeast and southeast come fishing for crappie here on Lake Talquin. It's also a big bass lake. It's a warm summer morning. It's almost 90 degrees already, and it's not just after 10 o'clock. And about myself, I live approximately 5 minutes from the lake. We are sitting on what has been described as a mini barge. It's a homemade boat. It's a registered boat because it's powered, but it has it looks more like a dock that's escaped from its moorings, and it has a canopy. So we're sitting around a table enjoying the summer morning in this quiet cove, shady cove in Lake Talquin.
And this is just the most pleasant place I've ever conducted an interview. I'm a very happy camera. And we're going to be talking today about your participation with the very first sort of group kayak trips that went down the Apalachicola River, and then I think an event that you called River Trek, where you paddled the river yourself as a fundraiser, and then the Portrait of a River project also. Just to give anyone who might be listening a sense of where we're going to go.
So you want to start on those, or do you want to start with personal history?
No, we'll start with your early life, yeah.
Okay.
Could you give us your birth date and where you were born?
Yeah, my birth date is October 15th, 1949. I was born in the St. Francis Clinic, which was a small clinic that my father, who was a physician, and his partner owned in a little town in the French-speaking part of Louisiana. The town's name is Arnaudville.
Could you talk about your early life in Arnaudville?
Yeah. Actually, my father practiced medicine in Arnaudville, and which is a really small town, and rural parishes, St. Landry, St. Martin, and serviced the people essentially he grew up with. He's a Cajun, I guess is more commonly referred to as that French group in southeast Louisiana, and he came back from World War II and wasn't quite sure he was going to practice, and his brother, who was also a physician, encouraged him to stay home and serve the community that he grew up in, which is what he decided to do, which was pretty uncommon. But turned out to be something he really loved and enjoyed because he spoke the French patois and was a physician, people really respected him, and he could communicate well with them, and he was one of them. And so we grew up in a little town smaller than Arnaudville, named Cecilia, which is unincorporated, still is unincorporated. Cecilia is I grew up only a couple hundred yards from the historic Bayou Teche. The Bayou Teche is a bayou, small river that eventually feeds into the Gulf of Mexico through the town of Morgan City. The Bayou Teche, the portion of the Bayou Teche where I grew up outside of Cecilia in the countryside, was approximately 5 or 6 miles from a huge swamp called the Atchafalaya Basin, which is a gigantic hardwood basin, and the Atchafalaya River, where I spent a good bit of time when I was a kid, is an ancient channel of the Mississippi River. In fact, the Mississippi River is still trying to go back to that ancient channel, but Corps of Engineers is not letting it do that. Anyway, so I grew up. My water experience shaped my life pretty significantly. Not just because it was in a Cajun culture where pirogues and being on boats is just a part of the culture, an important part of the culture. I would retreat. I got my first boat I got when I was 12 years old. My dad gave me a little John boat with a a small gas-powered outboard motor. And I just loved to retreat to the bayous in that little boat. And it was actually my transportation to other towns on the bayou before I could even was old enough to drive a car. So what still is remarkable to me about that time growing up is the freedom that I had, the trust that my mother and father had in me to just let me roam. Even, at night, I'd ride the bayous at night to go down to the American Legion home in the town south of Cecilia, which was Brobridge, which was where my uncle and his family lived, to go to a dance, just like I would go in a car and then come back in the middle, not the middle of the night, but late at night down the bayou. So, and that I just took all of that for granted, that's what every young boy, and it practically was true, grew up in that part of the country. And as I got a little older, I spent more and more time in the Atchafalaya River Basin, which was truly wild. The Bayou Teche, it was pretty well populated, but the Atchafalaya River Basin and the Atchafalaya River was truly a wilderness back then, and that wildness made a deep impression on me. That has shaped my life since then, and in many ways is directly connected to my love and my interest in the Apalachicola River and that whole basin and that whole ecosystem. So that is how. Those are my original connections to water and what it meant to me. It meant a peaceful place to get away from, a deeper connection with a kind of you could call it spiritual, with life and with nature. And I drew a lot of solace from those experiences. I built a lot of confidence, being trusted to go out into these wild places and on my own or with friends and navigate, plan and navigate through these wild places. All had a lasting impact on who I was, who I am to this day.
You said you used your boat to get around.
Mm-hmm.
What else did you do?
I didn't use it for fishing. It was mostly for transportation and just sometimes just for getting away from the house, getting away from home. I guess I was kind of a solitary kid in some ways. I did have friends, but I loved being alone. And so I would take my little boat, like in the summer particularly, which it was an aluminum boat, and I'd go down the bayou to where there were no homes in sight or around, and I'd shut the motor off and I'd lay in the cool bottom of the boat and just let the boat drift and look up at the sky and, look through the branches of a lot of the willow trees that overhung the banks. And so it was for escape and relaxing. It's one way I used it. Although, another part of my water experience was not local. It was on the Louisiana coast. My family had an old style West Indies style place on Grand Isle in Louisiana, which Grand Isle is the only natural sand beach barrier island in Louisiana. And so we would go there with my grandparents, I'd go there for entire summers. And the water supply was a cistern, so we gathered water from the rainwater from the roof. The refrigerator was gas operated. It was kind of a step back in time. And the island itself wasn't very populated, so we had a nice size aluminum cabin cruiser that we would take out fishing. We'd go about 50 miles out and fish. So, those were other water experiences, and that shaped me and what I love, and also part of my growing up, because my father would let me, quote unquote, captain the boat, and that was a big deal, because I was just a kid, 10 or 11 years old, and there's this good-sized boat, and everybody'd go inside when it was raining, and I'd stand out and bear the rain and pilot the boat home, and it meant a lot to me, It meant a lot to be given that responsibility and that I was trusted that way.
How did you even know to do something like lie in the bottom of the boat and just drift? Was this sort of inspired by anything?
I think part of it was cultural, because it was a French culture, which was kind of a real sensualist kind of culture. Part of it was just intuiting that, that it was hot and that would feel good, and I guess I enjoy the sense of drifting, of giving up control, and just relaxing. And somehow I think there wasn't any, I can't remember any specific inspiration, but for doing that, I think it was more just a kid's intuition that, do what feels good, and just doing it. Yeah.
Were you raised Catholic?
I was raised Catholic. Our entire town was Catholic. There was, and the town had less than 1,000 people. There was no government. The de facto mayor of the town actually was the priest, and so there were no other denominations represented in town. And it's only been in the last 15 years actually in that little town that there's been another denomination present there with a church. It was a highly segregated, of course, town. Back in that period of time, the segregation was still deep, and so there was another Catholic church, but it was a black church, and the two churches there was some friendliness. There were social events that the black folks would come to the white church, and the white church people would go to the black church for certain events and stuff, but truly, clearly segregated. So I definitely raised Catholic. Yeah. Do you want to know more about that?
Yeah, if you have more to say.
How I left Catholicism, perhaps, or?
Well, maybe let's ask in advance, when did you leave Catholicism? We'll try to keep with our chronological bit.
I can remember distinctly becoming disillusioned, and it was when the church changed its policy on, I call it a policy because I think of it that way now, but it was a law back then that you didn't eat meat on Fridays. And in the nuns, and this will give you some sense of how deeply Catholic this community is, the nuns would come into the public school to teach us catechism. And they were very, looking back, I know they were very fundamental in their Catholic beliefs. And so, we had quite lots of questions as kids when we were getting taught catechism particularly about the punishment for doing certain things. We were really concerned about that. And one of the questions we asked was, what happens to you if you eat meat on Friday? And the answer was unequivocally that it's a mortal sin, and mortal sin means, if you don't get absolution for that sin, that you'll be punished in hell forever. So it was a real, eating meat on Friday, it was a big deal to a kid and to me.
During Lent or just any time?
Anytime. I didn't eat meat on Fridays. And so when that changed, when all of a sudden it seemed to me that it was okay to eat meat on Fridays, my first thought was for how many, if millions and generations of people who had honored that rule, and had broken it, or had not honored it and broken it, and were suffering in hell, had died. What about them? And it seemed capricious and unfair, and for the first time, it put into my head the idea that the church is not, the Pope is not infallible. There was something about it that just kind of eroded my belief and my confidence in the church. And so that was the first deviation away from faith, from my deep faith in my inherited faith, because I never questioned it, until that point. So I just inherited that kind of belief and that faith system from my parents. So that was the first deviation. And then once I got to college, it was a clear break, and then move towards Christianity in a more general sense, and then more towards, from that point, towards a giant, what I call the big amen. It's just, what it really came down to in terms of a choice in life and belief was saying yes, acceptance, and saying yes to life and existence as it is, and as I was born into, so it became a real simple kind of belief system, and that eventually, I went back to my roots in terms of where I do feel a profound connection to life is in natural environments, and usually solitary moments in natural environments. So I seek that out. I treasure those moments, and so I do love spending time in wild places with other people, but I also, where I really do feel and find renewal is in solitary experiences in wild places.
Where'd you go to college?
I first started, I had a choice. I was given a choice by my father. I wanted, when I was a senior in high school, I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to study, I wanted to be an English major. And that, my dad being a physician and having come from a very poor family and worked hard to put his way through medical school, that he couldn't accept so he offered me a deal. He couldn't accept that was a good profession for myself. He didn't think I was making a good choice for myself. So the deal was he would pay for my education if I chose one of three professions: medicine, architecture, or law. So being kind of a creative kid, I thought of myself as having an artistic kind of inclination. I like drawing. So I made this association that architecture had something to do with art more so, and that my personality and what I enjoyed would probably fit better with architecture. So I studied architecture at Louisiana State University, which was my dad's alma mater. I had been accepted to Cornell, which was one of the best architecture schools in the country, and he was willing to pay for that. But somehow I felt it would have been a disloyalty to him and as a kid, because he loved his alma mater, so I honored what I knew he would prefer, and also I'd be closer to home, which I think he wanted me to be closer to home. Anyway, after struggling through almost 4 years of architecture school, I realized I really didn't have the self-discipline at that point to be a good student. I was distracted too easily by other experiences. And this was a time of, this was the late 60s, early 70s, when there was a lot of social movement. It's the period of time when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and Martin Luther King. The whole notion of the earth as an organism, was being formed. Earth Day was founded. All of these threads kind of fed into my decision that I shouldn't be in college at that moment. So I dropped out. I missed the draft because I had congenital fractures in my lower back. So I didn't have to make that decision about whether I was conflicted about the war, whether or not I would go to Canada, or alternatively, I would fly an F4 jet and be so I actually went into, before I dropped out, I was an ROTC. I was in ROTC, Air Force ROTC, with the thought in mind that at some point I was going to have to make a decision whether to fight or flee, the country. And fortunately, I didn't have to make that decision. So where I ended up after dropping out of school is my older sister, Judy, was a nurse, worked in a wilderness camp in North Carolina, and during the summers as the nurse, and had gone to nursing school with the wife of the director of the camp. And so I ended up there for a few summers and ended up in North Carolina, and it was a perfect place for me to transition away out of school and think about what I wanted to do with my life, and learn to do techniques for climbing, and was in a beautiful part of North Carolina. Well, it was there that I met the guy who was in charge of Indian lore at the camp, who was from Tallahassee, a guy who went by the name of Sakim. Charles Daniels is his name. His Indian name was Sakim. And he, at the end of camp, the second year I was there, he said, I could have gone anywhere on the planet practically, and he convinced me that Tallahassee area was just a beautiful place to be. And he described the coast and the rivers and the lakes, and and that there was a good-sized alternative community, which meant long-haired hippie kind of community, but people who were working who weren't just self-indulgent party animals, but trying to build alternative businesses and institutions, and that appealed to me. I was never, even though I was a long hair, I never considered myself to be a, drug, sex, and rock and roll kind of person. It was really more for came out of my concern for the planet, just concerned about socially where we were going, about social justice and injustices, and that's what pushed me in that alternative kind of direction. So I ended up in Tallahassee and discovered after a few years of doing various jobs, learning how to do framing and construction work, and picked up a lot of practical skills, is when I decided, after one extremely hot summer of really hard work, that maybe it was a good idea to go back to school. So I went back to school at Florida State and ended up getting a master's in communications. I was the first graduate in a new program called interactive communications. It had to do with, this was pretty later on in my life. I think it was mid 80s. Which was when, I guess the web was kind of on the horizon. It was when personal computing was really starting up. Apple was growing, and their influences, Microsoft was starting to develop some influence, and all that was kind of merging into new digital technologies, and that got my interest. And so I had worked as a project manager on a large National Science Foundation project called the Interactive Media Science Project, which was partnered with Houghton Mifflin Publishing Company, Apple Computing, Pioneer, which was the big sound company at the time, and produced Laserdisc, and to develop what were called interactive disc. So using the Apple's, which was then the state-of-the-art computer, was an Apple 2GS Laserdisc. We developed these science programs for middle school science kids called Science Vision. And I really loved being involved in that because I was working with different professionals I'd never worked with before, computer programmers, instructional designers, media people who I had worked with before, like videographers and photographers and graphic designers. And so I would go around and present to different groups our product that we had developed, which we were really proud of, and Houghton Mifflin was publishing. And it was in the course of doing that I met two professors from the communications department at FSU who invited me into their master's program, but also having more product development experience in them to co-teach some classes. So that's how I got into that master's program and graduated. And eventually, along that path, following the evolution of computing technology and kind of the merger of all different media into the digital domain, I ended up being the first professional hired to develop online learning at FSU by then President Sandy D'Alembert, and was the assistant director of online and distance learning is what we called it then, and which was where I was until I retired. I was the second person hired, and when I left, we had a staff of 80 and had developed a lot of online programs, so pioneered a lot of online programming for Florida State University. So that's my career track until retirement. That's my education in a nutshell.
Yeah. Was the wilderness camp like co-ed or just for boys? Was it for kids who were younger than you? You talk more about that, or how old it had been, and how much was the counterculture, if you want to call it, really involved with the camp, or more just some of you camp counselors had that, but it was a more traditional North Carolinian clientele? Or?
It was an old camp called Sequoia. It had been around for older camp, been around 30 plus years. It was boys, and there were sister camps that we occasionally have, mixed social kind of things going on. The age range was from teenagers to, I think, 7 and 8 year olds were our youngest campers. It was not a day camp. It was, kids would come for multi-week periods. And some kids would stay for 2 sessions. It would be practically the whole summer. It had a lot of great activities, field sport kind of activities, archery, riflery. Also had horseback riding. Climbing was a real popular program. Had a really expert climber who taught kids and myself all the climbing techniques, using rope and belaying, everything you needed to. And it was pretty rigorous and hard. It was a really good program. It didn't have a specific. It was kind of non-denominational, even although there were big, and did have a chapel, but the celebrations on Sundays were kind of rotated between representative denominations who were there. Kids would put a program together and every Sunday, which was pretty neat. There were campers there counselors there who, like myself, were looking for alternatives socially and were concerned about kind of the direction the country was going in. But the director, Bruce, was an ex-Marine and a great guy, but very conservative, and would not have been supportive had he been aware that some of us, I think he would have thought of us as subversives in his camp. But he and I were pretty close and trusted each other, and I saw no reason to challenge. I enjoyed that place and got a lot out of it. So there was one kid who really pushed Bruce to his limit, the director, and got fired, but by openly admitting to smoking pot off campus. But still, that was too much for Bruce. And back then that was generally the case. People were to be caught with pot was to be, could be severely penalized, arrested, and put in jail from, maybe even for years. So it was pretty big, pretty severe kind of punishment for back then.
Did you smoke pot?
I didn't smoke pot back then. No, I tried it. When I was at LSU, I did not. My common sense told me not to do it at camp and get involved with it at camp, because I knew Bruce would be intolerant, and it just didn't feel like the place. It just didn't feel like I I had responsibilities. I had these kids to be, I had 12 kids to be responsible for, and didn't want that to be compromised in any way, or be a bad example if they would become aware of it. But I was a pretty responsible kid. Yeah, took that seriously.
Did you go to wilderness camps when you were a child, or were you in the Boy Scouts?
No, our town was so small. We had a Cub Scout chapter, but it kind of fell apart, and there was not a Boy Scout. We didn't have Boy Scouts, so my kind of Boy Scout training was through my grandfather and my father. In terms of the ways of the woods. My grandfather was a woodsman of the world. He belonged to that organization. So those kind of skills you'd get, that I imagine, and what I know of Boy Scouts that you would get in terms of outdoor, survival, just this kind of the skills that a child who grew up in an urban environment might not get. That just came part and parcel with growing up where I grew up. I was given my first gun when I was 8 years old, which was a little shotgun, and which was a huge, responsibility as the way it was presented to me, and a big leap from maybe not so much for him, because every kid had a gun when I grew up, but I took it as, again, he was entrusting me with something, and that I should be responsible in the way I used the gun, the way I handled the gun. That was all taught. That was all quite intentional on his part, deliberate, but it's what every Cajun boy would maybe part of growing up, and girls. Girls were taught to hunt. So even though I was introduced to guns and I like guns and shooting, I didn't like killing things, animals. I knew it for sport, and some families truly, lived on a subsistence level from hand to mouth in Cajun families, and hunting really provided protein on the table and was important. We were financially, fed, and it was for sport. There was no need, and somehow that just didn't sit right for me. I just didn't want to. I didn't like killing things, for one, especially killing anything for sport. One thing I learned was that, that there's merciful killing of animals that are so badly damaged or wounded. You don't let them suffer. So that was one big lesson from being taught to hunt, that I learned that one thing I wasn't going to do is let some animal that maybe my father or somebody else hadn't killed outright, that it was merciful to put them out of their suffering. I forget where we were going.
I just asked you if you'd been to wilderness camp as a kid, and we covered that.
Yeah, no wilderness camps.
Could you talk a bit more about the alternative communities in Tallahassee?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first one, I got involved with a commune, actually, outside of Tallahassee, named Hickory Hill, because an old friend of mine was a member there, and I had been living in Tallahassee, which was, then not a very big town, but still for me was urban and dense, and I didn't feel comfortable there. I always feel more comfortable in rural settings. I learned by trying to live in an urban setting. So Hickory Hill was out in the countryside. Actually, where I live now is the same as the property that the commune constituted the commune. We just divided it up many years ago into private parcels. But so I had a friend who was there, and Hickory Hill was communal in that all the membership held the land in common. There was no private property, and on that property held in common what we call the main house, which was where the main kitchen was, central bathroom at the time. We also had a really nicely outfitted woodworking shop with all, commercial grade woodworking tools, which was really wonderful to have access to for later building my own home. My wife and I built our own home thanks to this. We were able to do it out of this shop. We had a candle making shop. We had a pottery shop. We had a sewing room with hundreds of sewing patterns and sewing machines and cutting tables. We had a pretty well appointed library in terms of collection. And we had certain programs. We grew a lot of our own organic food, or a lot of our own food organically. We raised chickens that we thought we would enjoy doing, but after the first slaughter of 80 chickens and cleaning them and freezing them, everybody lost their taste for chicken. The most outstanding part of it for me was called the Food Fund, where for $25, this is 1979, 1980, for $25 a month, you could eat practically as much as you wanted from the garden. And we had one person. This is getting to institutions in Tallahassee. One person was the shopper. Well, the shopper shopped at the food co-op, the Leon County Food Co-op, which was a cooperative, membership owned and run by if you worked at the food co-op, you got discounts on your whatever food you bought there. And the food that the food co-op was providing was, leaning towards trying to have more organically grown produce, grains, healthier foods. So we had one shopper and we got a family discount as a commune. And also part of the food program was there was the shopping, and then there's we would alternate cooking evening meals. And that one person who cooked the evening meal, and we would rotate it, would also clean all the dishes. So essentially, except for the evening when it was my responsibility, it was like going to a restaurant. And there was a kind of a natural sense of competition. Everybody certainly didn't want to, look bad or disappoint the diners that night. And so it was like this little restaurant right on the communal property. And if you can invite people over, you just have to let the cook know well in advance. So there were schedules, and everybody was scheduled to cook at a certain time. And then there were bulk foods that would be in the refrigerator and the freezer and stuff that everybody had access to for fixing their own breakfast or lunch and stuff. So we ate really, really well. And what was so interesting to me about it was, and rewarding, is that it had such obvious benefit to everyone who participated in it, that it almost managed itself. I mean, no one wanted to abuse it, So that was my first real glimmer into how, in group living, you could have a benefit that was just so clear to everyone that everyone wanted to sustain it, and so it was inexpensive. It was enjoyable because you'd sit down and eat with, friends and people and members of and sometimes meet new people that someone would bring into the community. So it was so different than any experience I'd ever had growing up, and one of the most rewarding ones. And I still reflect on it as, that was a great part of communal living, that aspect of it. Other institutions in town, well, the Leon County Food Co-op eventually became what is now New Leaf. New Leaf Market, which has been so that was a real success story in terms of alternative community. There are members who were part of not just of our commune, but the Miccosukee Land Cooperative, them and their children who have become real active in the Tallahassee community and have built businesses, and like Mad Dog Construction. There were others where they took some of the values, that carried the values that they had as younger people and in the alternative community into the community at large, that have infused into the Tallahassee community. And So the alternative community over the last 35, 40 years is, unless you've really seen that whole thread, when you can see that whole thread, you can realize that the alternative community has had a big influence on the evolution of Tallahassee, the greening of Tallahassee. Tallahassee's energy even policies have all been influenced by people who were originally part of alternative community way back then. Yeah. I can't think of any other obvious organization or business that, at the moment, but connected to the alternative community.
Yeah, I've heard of the Miccosukee Co-op, obviously. I haven't heard of Hickory Hill.
Well, they became Wetumpka.
Okay.
Yeah. And have you interviewed Helen Light or Steve Lightman? Or have you heard of either one of them?
But I saw you quoted Helen Light on the website. Yeah.
Helen was part of so was Steve Lightman. And they are when we get to whatever in the chronology, I'll reference them because they introduced me to the Apalachicola River because they were both studying it when we were living communally. Helen as a botanist doing field studies on the Appalach. Steve as an environmental scientist looking more at water management policy because he worked with the Northwest Florida Water Management District and later was consul to Governor Graham. And, this fight with the river has gone on for a long, long time. And they go way back to the beginning in terms of, especially with Helen, forming a scientific basis for defending the river. Connecting the dots in terms of the river and the estuary and productivity of the estuary. And Helen was really instrumental in providing the foundation for a lot of the later scientific research that, including her own, that really supports and actually now is being used to help defend the river. Yeah.
Did you go out to the river with them?
I didn't go out with them back then. Helen invited me a number of times and I didn't, but I was always curious about what she was doing because she'd come back in these big waders and they'd be all muddy and she'd be just like glowing, back to the communal house because she just loved being in the field and loved working on the river. So I was curious, and then she started drawing. She was called in to help with some studies on the Atchafalaya River, which is the river I grew up on. And, I learned from her that those systems were really similar, and that's why she was called in. And that really piqued my curiosity. But it wasn't until I retired that I made a real big commitment to know more about the river. Well, actually, it was 2 years before I retired, but through Riverkeeper that I experienced the river and its length on 2 Riverkeeper trips that preceded and inspired River Trek.
How did you end up on those first 2 trips that they organized?
Through Helen made me aware of them because Helen was one of the speakers who talked about the pressures on the river. So I learned about them through Helen. And coincidentally, once I learned about Riverkeeper through Helen, I met Dan Tonsmeyer, the Riverkeeper. And it turns out that Dan and I went to the same boarding school in Louisiana for a couple of years, even though Dan's younger than me. So we didn't know each other, but we went to the same school in Louisiana. Yeah, no, it was just this weird kind of connection. And he was close to Steve and Helen, and he would come visit Steve and Helen when they were still married and they were still living. After we had broken up the commune, we still had private parcels, and Steve and Helen lived next door to Judy and I.
Why did the commune break up?
I think we've thought about that a lot. Everybody who was involved. There were a number of reasons. Members wanted to be a little more comfortable, and build real homes or more weather-tight, warm, comfortable, dry homes. And because the land was owned in common, unless you could self-finance the home, no bank was going to loan an individual who, based upon the value of the property. So that was one thing, barrier to sustaining the place as communally. Another was the education system in Gadsden County was so poor that people were starting to have children and wanted their kids to be in the best school system possible. Most everybody involved with the commune was college educated, and education was good education was really important. That was another reason. We made all our decisions by consensus. So what that involved was even though a good process is just really labor-intensive process, and always involved, if there was a dissenting voice on anything, it could get really tiresome, and involved a lot of lobbying and caucusing for your point of view until finally there was a vote on something. And so it became kind of contentious times just because of the way we managed our organization. We were young, so there were, this was in a time of when the whole idea of, it wasn't free sex, but the whole idea of a sexual liberation, we should be more relaxed about our sexual behavior, was kind of in all of our heads. And so there was complicated sexual tension that was part of it. So, we all realized that we thought we could be beyond jealousies, and it just seemed that was naive, and that created some tension. Although that wasn't a major part of breaking up, because we all remained friends even after the breakup, and with only one or two exceptions that weren't related to relationship issues. And I think we all realized there was a valuable experience. It was an experiment in some ways. It lasted for over a decade, so it was successful in that sense. But for me, it was valuable in terms of what I learned about myself and about group dynamics. One lesson was, for me, that's still with me, is that in a group, even in a group that's become fairly cohesive, and comfortable, and there's some homeostasis, that a new individual coming into the group changes the group dynamic, but also can change the dynamic in the group between individuals. So it's before that person the group becomes something different just with the introduction of one new personality, which was fascinating to watch because it happened quite a few times. And sometimes it was really, a person was a great addition and influenced the group in positive ways. And sometimes the individual created a lot of division. It was a divisive personality or manipulative personality, but that one person could upset everything. So we were really cautious about bringing new people in, into the membership, because once membership was a big commitment and kind of irrevocable. You just couldn't kick somebody out, because the legal structure of the commune was actually a corporation. You bought into it, you were voted in by the corporate members, and you owned stock, which was the only thing we had of value was the land. So that was the only physical asset that your stock was good for. So when we divided up the commune, we divided up the land, essentially.
How many people were out there? Thereabouts.
Yeah, thereabouts. I think the core membership was about 12 or 13. There were some children involved who eventually moved away. And then there was kind of a fairly large peripheral community, because back then there were other communes, and one common thing were other commune members to travel from commune to commune and participate in work days to have a place to stay, which that also was pretty interesting part of it, to have different people just transient, coming through, and it's kind of like getting reports from the front in a way, about what was going on around the country at large. People from Colorado and people from, just all over the country would come through, and vice versa. We could feel comfortable going to other communities, to participate in what they were doing. and have a place to stay.
So you and your partner were together before the...
No, we met on the commune, and she was, at the time, she was with someone else, and unknown to me, they were having some difficulties. So there was a point where they broke up, and she and I got together, and then he got together with someone else, and we're still friends. I've always said, it caused some stress, but I've always said her ex and I probably been very close friends had it not been for the breakup. And even he never blamed me or projected any of what happened to them on me that I'm aware of. And he lives in Alaska every now and then. He comes through and we all have dinner together. And it was I think it was part of the experiment, was to try to expand our notion of family and community and be inclusive and work through that kind of stuff. Not just simply divorce and then that was it forever, And there were no children involved, so that wasn't a complication between my wife, and her partner then.
Have you two had children?
No, we decided not to. We got married a little late. We thought about having kids a couple of times. And that initial enthusiasm of making that decision, we kind of dissipated quickly, so we took that as, well, maybe we shouldn't have kids, And so no, we haven't had children. We became kind of...
It is a commitment, so that's a good thing.
Do you have children?
No.
We have... we kind of participated as professional aunts and uncles, in a sense, So to our friends who did have children, we took care, we'd take care of them. So we'd have the enjoyment of taking, being with children or not, whatever it was, that experience with a younger person. And I think we both know that there were experiences that there's a perspective that having children can give you in life that we may have missed. We can intuit it and kind of guess at it, but until you're in it, I don't think you really totally get it. So, but on the other hand, we've had a wonderful life. We didn't have the expenses of children involved, which became kind of the foundation for early retirement, and we ended up in in a good, comfortable retirement.
What age did you retire?
Well, the first time I retired, I was 57. The second time I retired, I was 64. So I was retired completely for 2 years. Judy's 7 years older than me, so she retired at 64 and has remained retired. And after 2 years after I retired when I was 57, I went back as a consultant with a statewide organization that supports libraries, and 30-hour maximum, flexible hours. It was a great job. Enjoyed it a lot. I thought that was the most sane job that I ever had, and I was compensated well, and I worked with great people. And I think if I'd had that job I could have kept that job it was fun. It was comfortable. It seemed right to have a nice balance between work and home and some flexibility, and of course I could work. I could do some work online by then, which made a big difference. Yeah.
So the first trip on the river in 2007. First, what were you guys calling it? And then could you, as best as you remember, go through a sort of day by day of it? Almost?
Yeah. Sort of. The model that I'm guessing Dan and Andy Smith, who was the executive director, adopted was you paid. The way the fundraising part was you paid, and the payment covered food, and everything else, all the expenses involved. And so and it was educational. That was a really big component of it. And it was a 7-day format rather than 5 days. So it was fewer miles traveled per day. And at each stop that I recall, there was some expert, some stakeholder speaking to the group about the river. Helen Light was one of them. There was a manager of a kind of a forest manager, a woodlands manager, not for a private private woods for commercial purposes. There was entertainment. There was food was provided in Bluntstown by a black church group and a choir, and let's see who else spoke to us. There were speakers just about every day, and they covered the river from a number of different perspectives, from a conservation perspective, from a commercial perspective and its impact on the river, from an environmental perspective, were the three primary focuses for the educational part of it. It's where I first really learned about, the river looks perfectly healthy. It looks like there's plenty of water in it. What's the deal? And that's when Helen Light started making all the, illuminated, why there are issues with the river, why it's important that the river floods, that it escapes its banks and draws all those nutrients from the floodplains into the river that go down the river to the estuary. How it was possible that what's happening many miles upstream could really impact, such a huge river. Why it could have an impact, when you disrupt the flood cycles, even though it looks like there's still plenty of water. What impact the dam had over history, historically, in terms of scouring the bottom and changing the rate at which water flows, the impact on certain species along the river. That all got spelled out, and those first 2 years were like that, actually, and I really can't separate the two very well, because they were very similar, in terms of the format. So I don't think we paddled to Allen Bluff the 20 miles the first day, and I think after Weewa and Stiffinugla were always part of it, and there was a point between Owl Creek, actually, and I think and Apalachicola that we spent the night. So we didn't do the whole leg from Owl Creek to Apalachicola on that format. But it was in the second year, to distinguish the second year, 2008 from 2007, is when I was paddling, that I thought, the first idea was, I thought I would like to do this solo, because I was going to turn 60 the next year, in 2009. And that I've developed the confidence that I could do it solo. And that came out of something you kind of, in our conversation earlier about your experience on the river, it was some of those moments when I'd go off by myself and paddle, that that part of the experience I wanted to extend. I wanted to have the whole trip, see what it would be like to spend 5 days on that river by myself. And I knew that because there were some dead zones in terms of cell phone coverage. There were still that I'd be out of touch, but so in some ways it would be a little risky because I wouldn't have any communication. But I've always had a lot of confidence that I can take care of myself in wild places, and that comes from my childhood, so that overrode that kind of concern. So the seeds for the idea of a solo trip came out of the 2008 trip. And then, because I was becoming more invested in Riverkeeper and thinking about wanting to be part of the organization, is when the idea to couple that to fundraising happened, and then the whole idea of instead of having a paddle-a-thon, having family and friends donate to Riverkeeper based on I think I assigned a dollar per mile kind of figure, but I can't remember exactly. Or maybe it was for the whole trip, sponsorship. So recommended levels of sponsorship for me that first year, and that's and do it in 5 days because I thought 7 days was just too long. And that's kind of the evolution of the 5-day fundraiser paddle-a-thon format. And I enjoy playing with words, and so river trek seemed to be, a good term for what that trip was about for me.
Yeah, where did that name come from?
I don't know. I think I plagiarized it. I'm not sure. No, there are other river treks, seriously.
Michelle Obama.
yeah, I did, from Michelle. No, there are other river treks there, and they're dissimilar. They're not the same. They're not fundraisers. In some cases, I think there's one in New England that's an annual event, but it's like a river cleanup trip or something. It's not an uncommon term, actually, river trek, but it is unique. The river trek, the Apalachicola River Trek, is unique in that it's a paddle-a-thon. So probably a web search. Anytime anything pops into my head, I want to check out, I immediately go to Google. So probably came out of that somewhere.
There's Star Trek and there's the Boer Trek, but I guess we're drawing directly from either of those necessarily.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's an Afrikaans.
There's Globe Trekker. Globe Trekker.
Afrikaans.
Trek is Afrikaans. That's right.
So,
yeah, I think you're right. Well, I did spend some time in South Africa. I went there.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. My wife and I spent, we had a nephew there with his wife who had worked there and gone to school in Cape Town for 2 years. And when he was leaving, he invited us to come spend a few weeks and show us around. So, yeah, we spent some time in fact, there were some Afrikaners on the plane who partied all night over the way to Cape Town. Never forget that. So that was kind of the genesis of River Trek and how it came out of the 2007, 2008 trips. And the solo trip, I think, is when I actually did that trip that I decided that I'd want to try to continue it, but with groups, And that came out of I then became a member of the board of Riverkeeper. Was doing a lot of support for them in terms of web development, communications, trying to improve their whole outreach, media outreach part of it, because I had that background. And developed, I knew Dan and developed a pretty close relationship with Andy Smith, and it was the next year, 2010, that was the first group trip. And the group trip that I led, 2010, 2011, drew from the Riverkeeper membership. It was kind of the logical place. And we kind of reached a ceiling in terms of what we could raise. It was just like, I think at the most about $4,000 or $5,000, which got me to thinking that, these are the only members who seem to really be interested in doing this, and they're tapping their friends and family, and you can't do that every year. And the Franklin County community is really relatively small and relatively poor, and the community that has the deep pockets and the people was Leon County. So I made it my personal mission as a board member to connect with the Leon County community. So Andy and I, I'd set up little speaking engagements and stuff, and we'd speak to Leon County. And it was and that had some success and developed a little more interest in Riverkeeper. And but it was in 2010 when Georgia Ackerman was on the trip that I knew Wilderness Way. I knew that she had connections to a pretty big community of paddlers, that she was an entrepreneurial kind of person, much different than our typical board member. Or member, actually, board member. And it kind of just on the trip, it just popped into my head that, this had been my 5th trip in a row. And that was kind of tired of it. Took a lot of organization by myself because I handled all the logistics and everything to get the group trips together. So I was a little tired of doing that. So I kind of, at the beginning of the trip, put the idea out to Georgia, and by the end of the trip, I felt like she was on board for taking over River Trek, and that it would be a good move for the Riverkeeper in terms of fundraising and outreach to a different community. And that was my thinking and my intuition too, that so Georgia didn't need a lot of convincing, but she bought into the idea. And then once that handover kind of took place formally, with Riverkeeper, is when I think she thought Doug Alderson would be a great partner, given his outreach to the state practically, and his experience in his job. And they made a great partnership, and what they've done with the River Trek in terms of its fundraising and its outreach, and it, has just been spectacular to me, and just, it's just wonderful that happened, that it actually played out kind of even better than I hoped it would.